Racist talk show host tries to humiliate black community leader. His epic clapback goes viral. A black man stepped onto the set of Morning Perspective with nothing but his truth and a lifetime of invisible scars. Before Malachi Brooks spoke a single word, he was measured, doubted, and quietly dismissed. Not because of his ideas, but because of the skin he wore. They never needed a rope to strangle a man's future here. It happened slower, quieter, under lights too bright to see the knife, with questions sharpened like plows breaking dry, blood-fed soil. Malachi Brooks sat at center stage, a lone oak against a furious wind, every wrinkle in his jacket stitched with years that no broadcast could erase. Across from him, Veronica Hartman smiled the way fences smile, all teeth, no welcome. The air smelled of scorched circuits and desperation, but beyond the glass, the delta breathed in its long, patient agony. Cotton fields gone fallow, rivers too tired to flood. America sang hymns about redemption, but Malachi knew better. Some stains didn't come out with prayer or progress. They had to be carried, mile by hard mile, until someone brave enough dared to call them by name. The cameras blinked alive. The question came, coated in sugar, but meant to gut him where he sat. Malachi did not flinch. He had not crossed generations of dust and fire to tremble now. Tonight, they would hear it all. The hope, the hunger, the broken promises stitched into the land, and for once, there would be no turning away. The room smelled of stage paint and nervous ambition, the kind of scent Malachi Brooks had learned to recognize years ago, long before he ever sat beneath television lights. It was the smell of places where truth was often polished away, made safe for consumption, places where people said all the right things while meaning none of them. He adjusted the knot of his simple tie, a hand-me-down from his father, and watched Veronica Hartman through half-lowered eyes, the way a soldier might watch the edge of a tree line, knowing danger rarely made a grand entrance. It slipped in quietly, grinning widely. Across from him, Veronica perched in her cream blazer like a porcelain doll at a wake, smile bright, voice tuned to the careful pitch of someone about to deliver a blow wrapped in courtesy. Around them, the audience shifted in their folding chairs, the cameras buzzed, and the red light blinked alive. Malachi could feel it, the old electricity crackling under the polished floor, the air itself swelling with a tension older than any headline, older than any town name printed on faded road signs on Highway 49. He was not new to this battlefield. They had just changed the weapons. Gone were the snarls and shouted slurs of his youth, replaced by the sly suggestion, the polite doubt, the deadly euphemism. Gone were the fire hoses and snarling dogs. Now they sent questions sharper than any teeth, laced with sugar, polished till they gleamed. Veronica's voice oiled its way across the space between them. "Mr. Brooks," she said, the words sliding from her tongue like honey over broken glass. "Your organization, Legacy Learning Collective, has done so much good. However, some wonder if focusing so much on race perpetuates old divisions. Wouldn't true progress come from looking beyond color?" It was an old question, one Malachi had heard dressed in 1,000 different suits, 1,000 different sanctimonious smiles, and each time it tasted the same, a request not for peace, but for silence. For a beat, he let the moment, taut as a rope pulled to its breaking point. In the back of his mind, he could almost hear his grandmother's voice, strong as river stone, reminding him that truth told in a whisper often traveled farther than one shouted in anger. Malachi's gaze didn't waver. "If a house is on fire," he said slowly, voice deep enough to anchor the room, "you don't save it by telling the family inside to stop talking about the smoke." The words dropped like stones into still water. The room shifted. Even the camera operators, trained for detachment, seemed to pause, the buzz of equipment softening for just a breath. Malachi leaned in slightly, the way a preacher does when he knows the next truth he speaks might crack something wide open. Progress doesn't mean forgetting where the wounds are, he continued. It means seeing them enough to heal them right. Outside the studio's glass walls, the Mississippi Delta waited, stoic and battered, fields once bled dry by history stretching beneath a darkening sky. Those fields had seen too many speeches about unity, too many banners promising change that blew away in the first hard rain. Malachi had walked those fields. He knew the taste of dust and disappointment too well to mistake easy words for real bridges. Unity wasn't a sentiment. It was a structure. Bricks laid by truth, mortar set with accountability. Anything else was a mural painted on a crumbling wall, beautiful for a moment, then gone at the first shaking of the ground. Veronica shifted slightly in her chair, the faintest crack showing in her polished armor. She opened her mouth to redirect, but Malachi was not finished. His voice, steady and sure, rolled out across the room like a freight train gathering speed. "The people we lift when we acknowledge history," he said. "They're not stepping on anyone's neck to rise. They're simply standing on ground that should have been theirs to begin with." Silence bloomed, thick and undeniable. Somewhere deep in the audience, someone exhaled sharply, the sound almost a prayer. Malachi sat back, hands folded, heart steady. He hadn't come here to debate existence or justify a wound still bleeding beneath the nation's polished floors. He had come to speak plainly, to lay stone where before there had only been ash and memory. And tonight, he thought, letting his gaze sweep across the bright, trembling studio, the building had just begun. The lights above Studio 5B buzzed faintly, a hum so thin it was almost a ghost. Malachi Brooks barely heard it over the thrum of blood in his ears, over the echo of old hymns sung under tin roofs long since rusted away. He sat steady, a quiet mountain in a storm others hadn't yet learned to name, and waited as Veronica Hartman gathered herself for another strike. She smiled that practiced smile, the one that said she wasn't the villain here. Her voice sweetened, careful as a cat's paw. "Mr. Brooks, don't you worry that programs like yours, focused so narrowly, might alienate others? Shouldn't opportunity be for everyone?" The trap was set neatly, disguised as kindness. But Malachi had heard that song before, sung in courtrooms, whispered in school board meetings, etched into letters politely declining the dreams of generations. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his mind flickered back to a bridge near his grandfather's farm, a bridge they used to cross when the river ran high. It had been a rough thing, half wood, half prayer, and he remembered how it sagged under the weight it was never meant to carry. Sometimes it would wash out entirely, and the people on one side would be stranded for months, watching others drive by on better roads and safer paths, never even glancing back. Malachi lifted his head and met Veronica's gaze, his voice smooth as riverstone. "When the bridge collapses under the weight it was never built to bear, you don't blame the ones still stranded. You build the bridge stronger." There was a murmur in the audience, low and stirring, the sound of something waking up. He leaned in slightly, pressing the moment further. "If you had a chance to rebuild that bridge today," he asked, his tone steady, but edged with something raw, "would you choose to make it strong enough for everyone, or just the ones already safe on the other side?" The question hung in the charged air, undeniable and unanswerable without revealing more than most people cared to. Veronica's hands twitched minutely over her note cards. The perfect lacquer of her performance cracked just enough for those watching closely to catch sight of it. Malachi pressed on, his voice softening, not out of weakness, but because the truth didn't always need to shout to be heard. Legacy Learning Collective isn't about lifting one group over another, he said. It's about repairing the bridge that was never finished, so that no child, no matter where they start, has to watch opportunity pass by on the far bank. In the second row, Janelle Price blinked hard, pushing back a welling pride she couldn't quite swallow. Young Tommy Reed gripped the edge of his seat so tightly his knuckles shone white under the bright studio lights. Malachi sat back, finally, the heavy, patient certainty of a man who knew the river's moods by heart. Veronica tried once more, her voice a little more brittle now. But fairness demands we treat everyone equally, doesn't it? Malachi smiled, not mockery, but something sadder, wiser. Equality without context, he said, is just another form of forgetting. The audience grew so quiet you could hear the faint whir of the overhead fans stirring the heavy southern air. Somewhere beyond the studio walls, the Mississippi River shifted again, indifferent to headlines, unmoved by pretty speeches. It had seen too much. It demanded something sturdier than promises this time. And so did the people watching. The weight of the moment pressed against the studio walls like a rising flood, threatening to spill over the polished floors and drown the stage in a truth too big to fit the frames they had built for it. Veronica Hartman shifted in her seat, the practiced sheen of her hosting smile fading into something tighter, more brittle. Around them, the air grew heavy with the unsaid, with the tension of old stories clawing their way to the surface. She tried to regain footing, reaching for the familiar crutch of polite skepticism. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice a shade sharper now, "don't you think that by constantly bringing up the past, you risk keeping people trapped there? Isn't it better to focus on the progress we've made?" It was not a new tactic. It was the oldest one, pretending the wound was healed because it made the healthy one feel more comfortable. But Malachi Brooks had not survived this far by mistaking comfort for cure. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table's smooth, untrustworthy surface. His voice, when it came, was steady as the riverbanks after a storm, still holding even when the world around them shifted and broke. "The past isn't a shackle we wear, Ms. Hartman," he said. "It's the ground we stand on. If that ground is cracked and poisoned, no matter how high we build, it will crumble beneath us." The words struck the room like a slow-moving storm, the kind that rolls in with a whisper and leaves nothing untouched. A few audience members, older, with faces lined by decades of seeing promises made and broken, nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. Malachi could feel it, the shift. Not in Veronica, perhaps, but in the crowd. The barrier between speaker and listener, performer and audience, had thinned until it was nothing more than smoke. He pressed forward, not with anger, but with an urgency that wrapped itself around every word. "We speak of the past," he continued, "because it is not past. It's stitched into the mortgage papers denied, the schools crumbling down roads paved for others, the prisons built higher than the schools ever were." There was a rustling in the seats, the kind of restless, uncomfortable shifting that happens when the truth touches a nerve too deep to ignore. Malachi's voice dropped lower, pulling them in closer. "I remember," he said, "standing barefoot on dirt roads while buses full of other children rumbled by, windows shining like mirrors we weren't allowed to look into. I remember teachers who taught 5 grades at once because that was all we were deemed worthy of. And I remember thinking, even at 8 years old, that some bridges weren't broken by accident. They were never built for us at all." He paused, letting the memories settle into the room's aching silence. "So tell me," Malachi asked then, his voice cutting clear through the thickening air. "How do we move forward if we can't even name where the road broke beneath our feet?" The question wasn't just for Veronica. It was for the audience, for the cameras, for the world beyond the glowing red recording light. And it struck with a quiet violence no shouting could ever match. Veronica opened her mouth, then closed it. The words she might have used to redirect, to soothe, to tidy up the discomfort, were nowhere to be found. Malachi leaned back slightly, not triumphant, but resolute. "This isn't about blame," he said. "It's about responsibility. It's about truth so sturdy it can carry all of us forward if we dare to walk it." Outside the studio, the evening had darkened into true night, but the air buzzed with something brighter, fiercer than neon lights could imitate. Hope, not as wishful thinking, but as a raw, necessary labor, the kind that tilled broken ground until something new could grow. Somewhere beyond the broadcast towers, across the fields and rivers and small-town sidewalks, hearts shifted, just a little, just enough. Because tonight, someone had named the broken places without flinching. And for the first time in a long time, the bridge didn't feel so far away after all. The broadcast ended, but the real story had only just begun. In homes from the Mississippi Delta to small towns dusted along forgotten highways, people sat back in their worn recliners and kitchen chairs, the blue glow of the television still washing across their faces. And they felt it, that slow, almost imperceptible stirring in their bones. Something had shifted. It wasn't the kind of shift that made headlines the next morning. It wasn't loud enough to drown out the noise of a country still trying to outrun its shadow. But it was there, deep and sure, like the first crack of thawed river ice when winter finally surrenders. The next day, the calls began. First, it was the principal of an aging elementary school in Shelby County, asking if Malachi Brooks could speak to the fourth graders about building bridges and what it meant to be seen and heard. Then it was a church in Yazoo City, offering their fellowship hall every Saturday for free literacy workshops. Then came the farmers from Greenwood, willing to donate an acre of land to build a community garden where children could learn to work the soil and dream bigger than the rows of cotton their grandfathers had been forced to tend. Within a week, Legacy Learning Collective's inbox overflowed. Emails from teachers, pastors, and grandmothers raising second generations. Some messages were hesitant, others urgent. But they all carried the same quiet plea: help us build what was left unfinished. Malachi read each one, his chest tightening with something too old to be called pride and too bright to be called sorrow. It was hope, yes, but the kind of hope that had been hammered into shape by 1,000 disappointments and still dared to stretch toward the sun. He gathered his team, Janelle, Tommy, Patricia Vaughan from the Gazette, and they laid out maps across the battered conference table in their modest office. No sleek headquarters, no high-rise skyline behind them. Just an old room with creaky floors, coffee-stained maps, and hearts that beat stubbornly for something better. "Where do we start?" Janelle asked, voice tight with the wonder and weight of it. Malachi smiled, slow and sure. "We start where the road broke," he said, "and we don't stop until the bridges outnumber the barriers." The first event was small, just 30 people squeezed into a sweltering church basement, listening to Malachi speak about history not as a burden, but as a blueprint for the future. By the next month, they needed tents to hold the crowd spilling into parking lots and grassy fields. Children who had never been given a microphone before now stood behind makeshift podiums, reading essays about justice, about dignity, about belonging. One night, after a pop-up workshop in Greenwood, an older man with hands like cracked leather approached Malachi outside. "You ain't just teaching 'em how to read," he said, voice rough with age and something older still. "You're teaching 'em they deserve to be seen." Malachi nodded once, throat too tight for words. In a world obsessed with fast victories, what they were building was slower, heavier, but infinitely more real. It wasn't a viral clip. It wasn't a slogan. It was trust, rebuilt acre by acre, voice by trembling voice. And always, always, there was the river. Some nights, Malachi would drive out past the edge of town, to where the fields met the water and the old bridge sagged across the dark. He would park, step into the thick night air, and listen. He heard the songs his grandfather once hummed under his breath, half lament, half promise. He heard the laughter of children who no longer believed they were invisible. He listened to the fierce, wild sound of something breaking, not a collapse, but a shell giving way to life. And he knew. This was only the beginning. Because once the bridges started rising, real bridges, made of truth and hard love and stubborn hope, they didn't just carry people across rivers. They carried them across generations. 5 years later. The bridges. We built. The river hadn't changed much. It still rolled slowly and stubbornly past the cotton fields and the sagging oaks, as if daring the land to forget what it had once bled for. But 5 years after that night in the television studio, everything else had begun to shift. Not all at once, and not without struggle, but in ways even the old-timers had to admit they could feel deep in their bones. Legacy Learning, Collective, had outgrown its first creaky office 2 summers ago. The new building was nothing fancy, just a refurbished elementary school on the edge of town, but the walls hummed with life. Inside, you could hear the chatter of teenagers learning to code alongside the steady murmur of elders teaching farming techniques that had been passed down like sacred scripture. Mornings started early and ended late, and the parking lot overflowed with battered trucks and bicycles with broken chains. Malachi Brooks walked those halls most days, not as a figurehead, but as a builder, a listener, a man who still wore the dust of every road he had traveled to get here. His hair had grayed at the temples, but the fire in his chest hadn't dimmed a lick. On a humid Wednesday in May, he stood in the back of the new community auditorium as a boy named Elijah Reed, Tommy's youngest brother, crossed the stage in a blue graduation gown, the first in his family to finish high school, the first to stand at that old, battered podium and announce, in a voice clear as a church bell, that he was going to college in the fall. The applause nearly cracked the rafters. Malachi closed his eyes for just a second, breathing it all in. The heat, the hope, the weight of a world slowly rebuilding itself brick by stubborn brick. Later that evening, sitting under the stars at the old bridge, now finally repaired and widened to hold more than just the lucky few, Malachi found himself thinking back to something his grandfather had once said. Plant your seeds knowing you may not sit under every tree. They had planted a forest. But not everything had been easy. There had been pushback, whispered complaints at city council meetings, anonymous flyers accusing the collective of special treatment and division. The same old fears, dressed up in new slogans. Once, someone had spray-painted slurs across the new library walls. They didn't cancel classes that day. They held them outside, right under the hateful words, so that every child could see for themselves that truth was not so easily silenced. Malachi watched them that morning. Little ones sitting cross-legged in the grass, teachers reading aloud about Harriet Tubman and John Lewis and ordinary men and women who had carved justice out of bedrock. And he knew. They were winning, not by shouting louder, not by burning bridges, but by building them higher, stronger, wide enough for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. That night, before the lights went out at Legacy's new campus, Malachi scribbled a question on the chalkboard outside the front office. It wasn't an assignment. It wasn't even directed at anyone in particular. But it was the kind of question that refused to sit quietly in a heart once it was heard. When you step onto a bridge someone else built for you, what will you build for the ones still waiting on the other side? The janitor found it the next morning and left it there, untouched. So did the teachers. So did the students. It stayed up for weeks, words chalked in dusty white, blurring and softening in the rain, but never washing away. And when visitors came, from Memphis, from Jackson, from towns farther than the river could touch, they would stand in front of that battered old chalkboard and read those words. Some would smile, some would cry, some would nod, as if answering a call too deep for easy words. The river kept rolling by, but now, for the first time in a long time, there were bridges, real ones, living ones, rising higher than the floods could ever tear down. And Malachi Brooks, sitting in his battered old truck at the river's edge, looking out across a future he might not live long enough to see in full, smiled. They had started with broken ground. They had ended with an open sky. And somewhere, in every child who crossed those bridges now, there burned the bright, stubborn fire of a story still being written, not in chains, but in stone, in hope, and in the unbreakable bonds of a people who refused to be erased. Today's story is a call to all of us. If you were Malachi Brooks, would you rise and stand against silence? If you were Veronica Hartman, would you face your discomfort and still choose the truth? And if you were sitting in the crowd, would you be brave enough to act, not just applaud? I want to hear your voice. Share your thoughts below. How would you have answered when history demanded courage? If Malachi's journey lit a fire inside you, do not let it die here. Like, share, and subscribe so that together we can carry these stories forward. Every comment you leave is not just feedback. It is an act of hope, a stone laid in the bridge we are building together. Thank you for being part of this moment, and for daring to believe that change begins with a single voice.